Prehistory is one of the most mysterious and at the same time one of the most impressive periods in the history of humankind. During its vast stretch of time, the foundations of civilization, culture, and daily life, as we know them today, were being formed. Many of us imagine prehistoric people as rugged beings clad in furs, hunting mammoths with spears, and living in caves. While this image is partially accurate, it hardly captures the full mosaic of life in ancient times. In this video, we will dive into the fascinating world of prehistory and uncover some unexpected, astonishing, and often entirely overlooked facts that might truly change the way you see this era. What if I told you that some prehistoric communities practiced forms of plastic surgery, or that children had their own specific burial rituals, or that the first calendars were created much earlier than we previously thought? Prehistory is full of mysteries we are only beginning to uncover. Prepare for a journey into ancient times, where every stone, every tool, and every skull whispers a story that has not yet been fully heard. And believe me, by the end, you will look at prehistory in a completely different light. Many cave paintings found all over the world were, until recently, thought to be the work of adult male hunters. However, more recent research shows that a significant portion of these artworks, including handprints, may have belonged to children or women. Discoveries in the El Castillo and Chauvet caves suggest that prehistoric communities had a much more inclusive approach to art than previously assumed. Creative expression likely served not only an aesthetic purpose but also a spiritual and social one that connected generations. Children may have learned to paint alongside their parents, not just for fun, but as a way to engage with ancestral stories in the spiritual realm. Art was not separate from everyday life. It was a natural part of it. Visual expression may have been a means of communication between the living and the dead, between people and the forces of nature. One of the most surprising archaeological discoveries of recent decades is evidence that some prehistoric people modified their teeth not only for health, but also for aesthetic reasons. In Central America, skulls have been found with decorative inlays of emerald or obsidian set directly into the enamel. Although this dates to a later Neolithic period, it still belongs to deep prehistory, where such cosmetic procedures would have been unexpected. These modifications were not performed at random. There was a system and technique. Specialists likely used stone tools and abrasive pastes to drill tiny holes and embed the stones. Some skulls show signs that people survived these procedures without infections, suggesting advanced knowledge of hygiene and wound healing. In Britain, France, and other parts of Europe, there are megalithic structures carefully aligned with the movements of the sun and moon. Stonehenge is the best-known example, but far from the only one. In what is now Scotland, circular stone calendars older than the Egyptian pyramids have been discovered. People observed celestial bodies to time crop harvests or seasonal animal migrations accurately. This interest in the sky demonstrates a high level of abstract thinking. There is no doubt that prehistoric communities paid close attention to natural rhythms and were able to associate the regular return of certain stars with the arrival of spring or winter. Such abilities required long-term observation, knowledge sharing, and the passing down of information across generations. In caves in present-day France and Ukraine, skulls have been discovered with holes from trepanation, a surgical procedure in which a portion of the skull is removed. What's even more remarkable is that most of these individuals survived the operation, as indicated by signs of bone healing. It is unknown whether these interventions were ritualistic, therapeutic, or motivated by something else, but it is clear that prehistoric people understood at least the basics of anatomy and healing. Trepanation might have been an attempt to treat epilepsy, intense headaches, or mental disorders. These surgeries, performed without anesthetics and in non-sterile conditions, required extraordinary bravery and skill. And yet the results show that these operations were deliberate and technically proficient, completely upending the notion of prehistory as a time of ignorance. The popular image that prehistoric hunters went out each morning to hunt a mammoth is highly misleading. In reality, such hunts were rare and extremely demanding events that required extensive preparation and cooperation from the entire community. People more often hunted smaller animals, reindeer, horses, hares, or birds. Mammoth meat was rare and required special strategies such as traps or organized group hunts. When a mammoth was successfully taken down, every part of the animal was used. The meat was dried or preserved in ice, the bones were used for constructing shelters, and the hide served as clothing or blankets. For prehistoric people, the mammoth was like a massive treasure, a resource that could support them for weeks or even months. The idea that prehistoric people only wore gray or brown furs is incorrect. Archaeological discoveries and experimental archaeology show that people were able to dye fabrics and hides using natural pigments. They used berry juices, tree bark, lichens, or iron oxides. These colors were not only decorative, they likely had ritual significance, marked social status, or even served as camouflage during hunting. In addition to dyeing, people also paid attention to decorating their clothing with various ornaments. We have found evidence of beads made from bones, teeth, shells, and stones, which were sewn onto the edges of cloaks. Some garments must have been very striking and may have functioned as visual markers of identity or religious affiliation. Prehistory was not merely gray, it was full of symbolism, aesthetics, and expression. Music played a vital role in the life of prehistoric communities. Archaeologists have found flutes made from bird bones and mammoth tusks, some over 40 years old. These instruments had precisely drilled holes and were capable of producing multiple tones, which suggests a refined sense of music and technical skill. They were probably used in rituals, dancing, or as accompaniment during storytelling. In addition to flutes, there is evidence of drums, rattles, or lithophones, stones that produce sound when struck. Music likely served not just as entertainment, but also as a spiritual bridge, connecting humans with invisible forces or natural elements. Prehistoric music was complex, emotional, and deeply embedded in daily life. Long distances did not present obstacles for prehistoric communities. Archaeologists have discovered traces of ancient paths that linked various settlements, hunting grounds, or sacred sites. For example, in England, there exists a system of ridgeways, trails along elevated ground used for thousands of years. Some paths were even laid with wooden logs to allow travel across marshy terrain. These trails were more than just practical routes. They may have been part of pilgrimages, ritual processions, or trade routes. People passed down knowledge about landscapes, directions, and landmarks, indicating a highly developed collective memory. Prehistory was not isolated, it was a dynamically connected world. Although there are no direct records of prehistoric languages, linguists and anthropologists agree that early humans used complex spoken language. They were capable of naming animals, telling stories, sharing experiences, and expressing emotions. Language likely evolved gradually, but even in the Paleolithic, it may have been sophisticated enough to support myth-making, planning hunting expeditions, and organizing social life. In addition to speech, other forms of communication existed. Symbolic markings on stones, gestures, or rhythmic signals that could be used across distances. These early communication systems laid the groundwork for the development of writing, culture, and collective memory. The first buildings were not merely random shelters made of branches. Over 20 years ago, people in what is now Ukraine were constructing huts out of mammoth bones, carefully arranged into circular structures. In Anatolia, the prehistoric settlement of Çatalhöyük featured houses made from sun-dried bricks with separate rooms, altars, and even frescoes. These structures show that people created environments that were not only functional, but also aesthetically and spiritually meaningful. Architecture reflected the values of the society. In some communities, elevated structures existed that may have served as ritual spaces or storage buildings. In others, Entire villages were organized around a central fire or shrine. Prehistory had its own form of architecture, clever, symbolic, and adapted to both landscape and climate. Despite the absence of money or paved roads, long-distance trade thrived in prehistory. Archaeologists have found flint from France and Scandinavia, Baltic amber in southern Europe, and seashells far inland. This demonstrates that people not only traveled great distances but also maintained complex networks of exchange and trade. Trade included not just raw materials but also ideas, technologies, and symbolic objects. Some artifacts, like jewelry, decorative weapons, or ritual items, held extraordinary value and may have been passed between communities as prized gifts. Prehistoric trade laid the groundwork for cultural exchange and helped build an interconnected world long before writing existed. While earlier interpretations often portrayed prehistoric women solely as gatherers and mothers, modern research offers a far more complex image. In many burial sites, women appear with tools, weapons, or ornaments that indicate prestige and authority. In some cases, they were buried with more reverence than men, suggesting the presence of matrilineal societies, where lineage was traced through the female line. Women may have served as shamans, healers, guardians of tradition, and holders of sacred knowledge. Figurines like the famous Venus of Dolny Viestonis depict the female form as a central symbol of fertility, nature, and life. The role of women in prehistory was not passive, it was essential and often even leading. One of the most significant moments in human history was the domestication of animals. It wasn't just about practical needs, such as meat, milk, or labor, but also about the relationships that people formed with animals. The first domesticated animal was the dog, likely over 1500 years ago. It served as a companion, protector, and helper in hunting, and some burials show that dogs were considered part of the family. Gradually, people began to keep sheep, goats, and cattle. This step transformed entire communities. People began to settle, build enclosures, and plan for long-term survival. The bond between humans and animals in prehistory wasn't just utilitarian. In many cultures, animal companions were associated with gods or spirits and were revered as sacred beings. Studies of human skeletal remains and artifacts show that prehistoric people had access to herbs, salves, rituals, and even surgical techniques. Some finds include plant remnants with medicinal properties, such as yarrow or wormwood. People knew how to make poultices, disinfect wounds, and likely even set broken bones. Healing, however, was not just physical. The spiritual dimension played a significant role. Shamans acted as intermediaries between the world of the living and the world of spirits, and often combined natural knowledge with rituals, chants, and symbols. Health in prehistory was understood as a balance between body, spirit, and nature, and healers were the keepers of this balance. The freezing winters of the Ice Age presented enormous challenges, but prehistoric communities found ingenious ways to cope. They wore layered clothing made of fur, carefully sewn and often lined with the hair turned inward for insulation. They built shelters that effectively retained heat, whether huts made of hides and mammoth bones or semi-subterranean dwellings dug into the earth. Fire was not just a source of warmth but also of light and psychological comfort. Some archaeological sites show evidence of firewood storage, pre-winter collection of dry wood, and careful planning for heating. Winter was a powerful enemy, but people did not face it passively. They fought it with organization and creativity, demonstrating their extraordinary adaptability. Many of the prehistoric jewelry items from the Paleolithic, Mesolithic, and Neolithic periods were not created merely as decoration. Beads made from bone, teeth, shells, or stones often carried specific meanings, indicating social status, tribal affiliation, protection from evil, or remembrance of ancestors. Some finds even suggest that jewelry played a role in initiation rites or romantic courtship. Each piece was crafted with care. Tiny holes were drilled using flint or obsidian, Ornaments were polished and strung on cords made of animal sinew or plant fibers. Prehistory was not just practical, it was also aesthetic and spiritual. Jewelry items were full of meaning and often outlived their wearers, becoming family amulets passed down through generations. Archaeological findings show that people used sharp shells, flint, or obsidian blades as shaving tools. Shaving one's head or face may have had practical reasons, like hygiene or warmth, but it also likely had ritual or social significance. Some cultures appear to have decorated their bodies not only with pigments, but also with scars, tattoos, or distinctive hairstyles. Appearance clearly mattered even in prehistory. There's evidence that people used reflective stones or the surface of still water to check their faces. Grooming could have been connected to social roles, religious functions, or simply the human desire for beauty. Aesthetic care was not a luxury. It was a natural part of prehistoric life. Long before the invention of writing, people passed down knowledge, myths, and events through storytelling. Around the fire, beneath the stars, or during rituals, stories about the creation of the world, heroic ancestors, spirits, and daily struggles were shared. These stories were not only remembered but also adapted to fit the audience or the times. Storytellers were respected members of the community. Their ability to captivate, educate, and entertain was key to maintaining cultural continuity. Storytelling was not just about words. It was enriched with gestures, music, props, and symbolism. Through oral tradition, prehistory lived on, shaping identity and preserving collective memory. Although hierarchical structures appeared in later periods, many prehistoric communities were surprisingly egalitarian. Resources were often distributed collectively, decisions were made through consensus, and wealth was not concentrated in the hands of a few. These models were particularly common among nomadic hunter-gatherers. However, this does not mean there were no roles or specializations. Differences existed, but they were expressed through experience and contribution to the group rather than power or wealth. Egalitarian structures strengthened community cohesion and ensured survival in harsh conditions. Prehistory was not only about survival, it was also a time of cooperation and solidarity. In cave art, figurines, and ritual objects, animals such as bison, horses, deer, and bears often appear. These animals were more than food or prey. They held symbolic value. In some cases, they may have been totemic beings, ancestors, or spiritual protectors. The bond between humans and animals in prehistory was profound and sacred. A hunter was not necessarily the enemy of the animal, he could be its brother, continuing the cycle of life. Some rituals show people wearing animal masks and dancing in trance-like states. Animal spirits were revered and called upon for help. The worlds of humans and animals were not separate, they were interconnected through meaning, emotion, and belief. Even without paper, compasses, or GPS, prehistoric people were incredibly skilled at navigating the landscape. On hunting expeditions, they traveled tens of kilometers a day, often through challenging terrain, and still always found their way back. They observed the position of the sun, the shape of the land, the behavior of animals, and the direction of the wind. All of this allowed them to memorize routes, obstacles, water sources, or hiding places with great accuracy. These mental maps were passed down from generation to generation and functioned much like today's navigation systems, except they lived in the mind and were reinforced through storytelling, gestures, and lived experience. The memory of prehistoric people was exceptionally trained, as remembering the path could mean the difference between life and death. Burial practices in prehistory were far from primitive. In fact, they were often highly elaborate. People buried their loved ones with grave goods, ornaments, pigments, and sometimes food. In some areas, entire necropolises were created where the dead were interred for generations. These were not merely places to dispose of bodies. They were sites of communication with the ancestors and maintaining a connection between the living and the dead. In certain cultures, the skulls of ancestors were preserved, decorated, or displayed in places of honor. Evidence from the Levant includes skulls modeled with limestone faces. These practices show that prehistoric people had a deep relationship with death and sought to understand what lay beyond. Across many locations, mysterious carvings, repeated symbols, and geometric shapes have been found. The most famous are from Lascaux Cave, but similar markings appear in Africa, Asia, and Australia. Though not writing in the modern sense, these may have been forms of visual language used to convey information or preserve spiritual meaning. The symbols may have marked territories, sacred places, or important events. Sometimes they appear alongside animal paintings, sometimes alone. In all cases, they suggest that prehistoric people were already seeking ways to record the world around them, not just with words but also with images. We may be closer to the origins of writing than we previously thought. Some prehistoric structures are so durable and monumental that they have lasted for thousands of years. Besides the famous Stonehenge, there are menhirs, dolmens, and entire arrangements of stone circles scattered throughout Europe. These constructions were often aligned with solar or lunar cycles, serving as calendars, sanctuaries, or gathering places. Their creation required incredible coordination, technical skill, and knowledge. Stones weighing tons were transported over great distances, erected without metal tools, and placed with astonishing precision. Prehistory has left its monuments not only in memory, but also in the landscape, silent witnesses of a time when human strength and belief were united. Prehistory is not just a distant period that ended with the rise of the first civilizations. It is a deep chapter of human history in which the first dreams, the first rituals, and the first connections to nature and the world were born. Every bone tool, every cave painting, and every stone circle is a testament to our human origins, to our courage, creativity, and longing to understand life. Today, we uncovered 25 fascinating facts that prove prehistoric humans were far more than just survivors. They were thinkers, builders, artists, storytellers, and spiritual beings, and in their story, we find the roots of our own humanity. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the deep past. If you enjoyed this video, I would be grateful if you subscribed, left a like, or shared a comment. Your support helps bring these stories from our ancient ancestors to light for others to discover too.